Thank you everybody for being here. Really appreciate it. I just got in last night and it's been so long since I've been in Austin that the last time I was here, Lyft and Uber were not allowed here at a time when they were hot in the rest of the country. And so I walked to breakfast this morning up Congress, and man, Congress has changed since I've been here last. So anyway, that's sort of one of the themes I want to talk about here today. So
it has changed a lot.
It's changed a great deal. So as she mentioned, I'm Jacob Ward. I'm from NBC News, Mayor Adler of Austin, Mayor Suarez of Miami. Thank you so much for being here. So we're here obviously to talk about how do we replicate Silicon Valley's success in your respective cities and in cities across the country. Coming from the Bay Area as I do, I also know there's a lot of complication that comes with Silicon Valley and its presence there. And so maybe let's just talk a little bit first about sort of how, as mayors yourselves, and how you think, because I know that you are the head of the technology group of mayors, you are president of the Council of Mayors, so speaking for mayors across the country, when you look at a region like the Bay Area and Silicon Valley and what it has meant, what do you think about? Let's start with you, Mayor Adler. I mean, what role does it play in the imagination of an American mayor?
Well, I think that it creates a sense of what's possible. What's happened in the Silicon Valley has been just incredible. It's birthed a lot of ideas, a lot of energy. So it's a wonderful, wonderful place. It's also an opportunity to look at from a city perspective on the challenges that are associated with the growth that comes with that. As you get more and more people, as costs go up, it's harder and harder to hold on to people. I love San Francisco. It's a great city, and I love being there. It's a different city than the one that I visited back in the late 70s. San Francisco was a city that really led with creating art everywhere in that city. That comes from the diversity and the integration of all kinds of people. You go there today and San Francisco is still a phenomenal place, doesn't create art everywhere the way that it used to. It consumes art. And Austin is a city that still creates art everywhere. And we have to hold on to that. And you try to go to school on what other cities do to try to preserve the people that make this a special place. And it's hard to do, but that becomes then our existential challenge.
Yeah. And for you, Mayor Suarez, what about you when you think about Silicon Valley?
I think when I look at Silicon Valley, I think a few things. One is they are sort of on the cusp of innovation, right? And understanding that cities are becoming more and more, and the world is becoming more and more technological. And so as you consider how do you create an economy that can create high-paying jobs for your residents so that they can provide for their families. We see all kinds of issues from housing to transportation, which are societal issues that, as a mayor, you want to empower your residents, give them an opportunity, to be successful. But to do that, it seems like you have to be one step ahead. Right? And I think what Silicon Valley has done successfully in my lifetime is obviously create the kind of companies that propel the economy and propel solutions and create wealth and generate wealth, which is something that obviously in our cities, we'd love to see every single member of our city be successful. I mean, there's no mayor, if they could, with a magic wand, create prosperity for every single citizen, that wouldn't do it in a heartbeat. And so I think we're trying to do that in our own way. We understand in Miami that technology drives the economy and will continue to drive the economy going forward. I often use the example of my 3-year-old daughter, who's about to be 4, who, I'll never forget it, maybe even already a year ago, would take a selfie with her pacifier. And it just highlighted to me how ingrained technology is in the fabric of our children, right, and in our lives, right? It's everything that we do involves some level of tech, and so I feel like cities have two options. They can pretend that doesn't exist, and sort of the ostrich effect, bury their head in the sand, and or be afraid, or they can seize this generational opportunity where technology is becoming more decentralized than ever. And I think Austin and Miami are two good examples of that. And you can build real ecosystems, build real prosperity, and prepare your cities for a future that is extremely disruptive, which can be very scary for many.
Do you think, Mayor Suarez, that there's a set of parallel conditions between Miami and the Bay Area that are important, or is at this point, I think about the history of Silicon Valley, right? You have the rise of the semiconductor industry, you have this military connection, you have the presence of Stanford and other great universities. But I also think today we're living in this, as you say, a very decentralized time when you can really live anywhere and in theory be part of tech. Does that make it easier for you to help create the conditions that give rise to technology in a city like yours, or does that somehow take some of the inputs away from you that you might once have had when it comes to creating infrastructure and the rest of it? What parallels do you think there can be between Miami and Silicon Valley?
Well, it's definitely easier for a city like Miami to be successful in a modern day world where there's so many fluid dynamics, right, that help define success. I think Miami was always very entrepreneurial. We have a thriving small business community. We create a lot of companies. We just were never, up until our generation, up until this moment, we were never able to really scale, right? We're not creating the kind of companies in Miami that were sort of changing the world, if you will.
Why is that, do you think?
I think we're a very immigrant community. I think many people in Miami were very successful. There's a lot of success and a lot of one generation success stories. But it wasn't necessarily in tech, A. And B, I think, the definition of success for many was, we owned a home, maybe you have a vacation property, maybe you have a boat, you're successful. There's no need for more, right? There's no need for this sort of hyper success. I think what makes Silicon Valley different in the Silicon Valley model that we're starting to see now in Miami is it's not hyper success necessarily for the accumulation of wealth per se. It's hyper success for the accumulation of impact,
yes,
right? And doing something that matters and doing something that changes lives. And I think that is exciting at a different level. The fact that it creates wealth is almost like a byproduct of doing something that's really, really meaningful.
That's very interesting. I think of this, I wonder what you think about this, Mayor Adler. I constantly bump into these very humble seeming, hoodie wearing, entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley, and then you speak to them and they really do think about a global impact. And I always think to myself, as someone who's full of personal insecurity, how do you wake up in the morning and think you're going to affect people on multiple continents? That's such a crazy sort of, way to wake up in the morning. But do you think, did Austin also have to make that kind of transition? Is this a city that thinks about being, Miami once called itself the gateway, the gateway of the Americas, right? It was going to be this global capital. Does Austin need to think of itself that way to replicate the success of Silicon Valley?
I think that the concept of having impact and social impact at scale drives this generation in ways that probably did not drive mine. But it is in everything. And I think that in this city, it's cultural. And I think this city has always self-selected, or for people who are self-selecting locations. It's kind of who we are, I think, in this city. I think, though, that they're all trying to have kind of social impact, but they'd love to be the unicorn that also drives the great wealth, too. But the social impact, I think, is a greater driver. Yeah.
And do you think, Mayor Adler, that there's is there, what inputs, what levers are available to you to create, I was just talking to somebody who is literally here in Austin, literally just being paid to kind of hang out, to be, had a successful career in tech elsewhere, came here, and now is just being paid to sort of be an innovator and be around. How do you create an environment in which that person puts down roots, wants to be here, wants to create a community around them? How does that even work at your level?
Well, I think that a successful tech community begins with the people, and it really is all about the people. And one of the things that's exciting about Austin is the number of people that are touching or involved with tech development in our city. And And I think it's the same thing that drives them, that drives other people to come to the city. It's other than the talent and the cost of doing business and the tax structure. But I think that, you know, being having phenomenal music, and I hope that everybody's getting a chance to really enjoy that in the city, is a big reason. Having the best breakfast tacos in the world. Don't believe San Antonio, they lie, right? But I think that is, it's a really pretty city. Yeah. I think that drives, I think that companies are coming here because the people that they want to have work for them want to live here. But people who are being paid just to be in this environment, I think that the bouncing off of ideas, the fertile ground that creates, I think that in terms of levers from where we are as government, I think it's just to facilitate that quality of life and that opportunity for people to be able to gather. Having the universities here, having the engineering schools, a big component of it, again, because it impacts the people who live here.
Right. Mayor Suarez, I want to start this one with you. I'm thinking about like how I would try to draw a contrast between where a city like Miami is now with tech money, with the opportunity in front of it, as compared to where it was, let's say, in the late 1970s. And so let's imagine for a moment that you are sitting with a mayor from that time and trying to explain, here's what's currently going on in Miami, as opposed to what it was like, you know, in a much more difficult time. How would you explain to one of your predecessors where you are at now as a city and what you are, you know, what challenges you face and what opportunities you have?
Before I answer the question, I just want to say that I vouch for the breakfast burritos and the boots from Austin. So very, very much top notch. So I knew that mayor from 1972. Right. His name was Maurice Fray. His sons are friends. We were friends. He just unfortunately recently passed from cancer. He was actually my father's predecessor. So my dad was mayor from 1985 to 1990. So I've had these conversations with the mayors of the 70s, the 80s, and I have a mayor from the 90s on my council right now. And I think what they would all say is the following, and you sort of touched on it where you said, we, for a generation, I would say, have been known as the capital of Latin America or the gateway to Latin America. I think what I see happening now is a metamorphosis of Miami. I look at us, and I've used this term, the capital of capital or the epicenter of capital, because I feel that we're in the middle of 5 or 6 mega markets. I'm going to throw Austin in there and say, you know, Miami, New York, you know, Silicon Valley, Austin, South America, the Middle East, and Europe. And no one of those 6 markets is closer to the other 6 than we are. So we're kind of in the epicenter. And I think as the world changes and becomes more decentralized and, you know, talent is more decentralized, I think what you'll see with those mega markets is there'll be aggregation and deployers of capital centers, right? They'll be where the people aggregate capital and deploy capital. It won't necessarily be where all the jobs are, per se. So I see cities like Austin and Miami, they'll create companies, and they'll create companies for everyone, and it will benefit not just urban America, but rural America as well. So you'll have people that can get paid, you know, $100,000, $150,000 in a job in a place with a significantly lower cost of living, right? So, and the company will be born in cities like Miami and Austin, will be capitalized and scaled in cities like Miami and Austin, but they will employ people across the country. And I think that's a very exciting new phenomenon with remote work. I was looking at some of the figures in terms of how much time in traffic was saved through remote work. And the figure that caught my attention was, it was in 1 year, 23,000 lifetimes were saved. The time of 23,000 lifetimes. So I think that's a radically new disruption that's really changing how cities are positioned. But Miami was basically a real estate and banking town in the 70s. And now we're becoming a technology and finance center. And so that creates more diversification. And when you have a pandemic, you're not relying completely on, for example, tourism, which was decimated during the pandemic.
Mayor Adler, do you imagine Austin as a sort of center of capital with a decentralized workforce that sort of reports into it, I guess? Or does that model that he's describing
I mean, that very well could be the model in everything that's happening. I think that Austin's place historically has been, we often say that Austin is a city where ideas go to become real. So I think in this city, there's a real concentration of people that are making things, that are developing things, finding the applications that can be built on top of the protocols so as to give inherent and intrinsic value to some of the new technologies. I think that's our place, but it has always felt that way. I got here as a student passing through, not intending to stay, got caught by the music and the breakfast tacos and this feeling of entrepreneurship and innovation, and stayed. But South by started 35 years ago, and it was about artists that were just phenomenal with incredible innovations in music, trying to connect them to record labels and to managers to get greater exposure. And that's what South by still is, except that in this part of it, the artists are not musicians, they're creators and builders and coders, and they're still looking for the managers and the record labels, but now it's venture capital and trying to find cities. There are 30 mayors here trying to find places to build out applications. So in a lot of ways, Austin's role in this, I think, is consistent with who we are and who we've been for a long time.
Do you think, Mayor Adler, that there's I think about so let's imagine that this is how a city like Austin or a city of Miami functions, right? It's a brain trust city, it's a finance capital. So a couple months ago, I toured a encampment of folks living basically on the flight path to the San Jose airport. And it's about 10,000 people living on this open space along a river in San Jose. And they are unhoused, they are, and you speak to these folks and they're living in like 14th century conditions. They're absolutely destitute. And you speak to them and you say, how did you wind up here? And there are, of course, substance abuse problems, there are, of course, mental health issues, but a huge number of them, they'll be living out of the back of a car, and they'll have a boat trailer with them from the house that they had in the suburbs somewhere. They were 1 or 2 rent payments, mortgage payments from falling out of their place, and suddenly the place became totally unaffordable and they fell out of it. And this is within 2.5 miles, 3 miles of the biggest companies in the world in the history of capitalism. So I guess I'm wondering, if this comes to pass, and already just being here today, I can sense how much Austin has changed, as you say. What do you do? How do you keep from losing, the great Keep Austin Weird bumper sticker spirit, right? How do you keep both the cultural spirit, but also how do you keep people from falling out of their houses as extraordinary wealth pours into this town?
Well, that's the existential challenge for the city. As I said earlier, it's preserving the people. We can already see the questions for this session, this panel, coming in asking the same kind of question. We have to go to school on the cities that have gone before us, and no one has really figured this out yet.
Let me just be clear. The Bay Area has not figured this out, right? I don't by any means wish to say that we know what we're doing either.
We have to increase housing supply. And we have to do it in lots of different ways with our land development code, with how we work our development services. We have to increase the supply of housing. In Texas, we don't have a lot of the tools that the cities have in California because we have a legislature that's taken a lot of those tools away. So we have to find the incentive programs that drive the creation of housing that's more affordable. We have, homelessness is a challenge, and the single best correlator with increased homelessness is increased housing costs. Because as you say, while there are factors that take someone into that place, most of the people that enter it are entering it as the result of a perfect storm. Here in Austin, we looked at what was happening on the West Coast cities. We looked at our challenge, which is about average for the country, but it knew for an absolute certainty that if we didn't do something, in 8 years we would be where San Francisco and Seattle and Portland and LA are. And we went to them and said, what do you wish you had done 8 years ago to avoid being where you are today? Because the scale of the challenge there is so great. I just don't know what you do. And the answer came back to us, don't hide the challenge. Because if you're successful in hiding it, it will continue to grow until it's too big. Then you can't hide it anymore, and you can't fix it. So in this community, we made it very visible in our community. And we have a community now that's rallied around trying to invest in the services and in the homes and in the entire operating system, as it were, to be able to get people, have people avoid coming on the streets, get them off the streets and to reach equilibrium. But it is about housing, and it is about affordability, because we won't be Austin if we can't meet that challenge.
I feel like the only place I have ever seen in the world that does not seem to have this problem in a fundamental way is Berlin. And that's almost entirely because Berlin, when the wall fell, suddenly doubled its housing stock. There was this incredible greenfield opportunity to put people in all sorts of housing. And no, I don't know an American city that has dealt with that properly. And it's certainly not one of the scale of the two cities that you guys run.
I think that's true. We did have, for the very first time, our entire community come together, the business community and our home advocates, the civil and criminal justice folks agree on an overall plan. It is expensive to actually set up a system that could get you to equilibrium. For us, it's about $500 million on a 3-year spend. But because we actually saw what was happening and we didn't hide it, we have the momentum to fix it. We've raised 400 of the 500. My hope is to be able to raise the last 100 here over the next several months, and then I hope to be that city,
right,
and to have a model that other cities can look at.
500 million, I'm sorry, friends, I have a question for you in a moment, but I'm just so interested about this. $500 million over 3 years accomplishes what?
It sets up the system.
So how many people can you support with that? How many? What?
Well, for us, it will get probably a little over 3,000 people, in addition to what we're doing now off the streets, but it gets social services for a number 5,000 to 7,000 people. But mostly it gives us the capacity all the way from emergency sheltering up to permanent supportive housing, so that we can house people at the same rate that they find themselves on the street. And that we can take people off the street quickly. Because the longer somebody stays on the street, the harder it is to get them off the street. So you just need that system. We've done it with veterans, as many cities have. But it's hard then to scale from veterans to the entire community because the initial cost to set up the system is so great.
So vast. Mayor Suarez, I think of Miami, I mean, its cultural identity has in so many ways been the opportunity to come to this great nation, start a life for your family. Do you think that is something you can keep and preserve even in a city that becomes a global center of finance, a place where money flows and flows out of?
I think so. I mean, it's part of our identity. It's interesting. People don't often know that I was the first mayor of Miami actually born in the city of Miami in its entire history, 125 years. So that's an interesting phenomenon. And I would say some of the studies that I've seen or statistics show that 60 to 70% of Miamians were not born in Miami. So that's actually, so the prior 125 years is the predominant condition. I'm sort of the outlier, right?
And what does that tell us about Miami, that it's been so transient?
I think what it tells us about Miami is we are very embracing of people from the outside, right? Whether they're from this country, other parts of the country, New York, California, or whether they're from other parts of the world, right? South America in particular, Central America in particular. It's just who we are. It's what we're accustomed to. I mean, I just had an event before I came up here trying to bring 50 Ukrainians to Miami to help, get them situated, get them jobs. And so that's our spirit. It's sort of, if you would brand Austin as sort of Austin, keep Austin weird, Miami is sort of a city that's very accustomed to having people from the outside. So I think that's not something that I see changing anytime soon because it's part of who we are. We constantly have waves. Every time something happens in South America, if there's an authoritarian regime that takes over, we get a wave of people, foreign investment, et cetera. And so I wanted to just touch on the housing thing if I could.
Yeah, please.
Just a second, because I wanted to say a few things. One is, it's not an Austin or Miami thing. This is an America thing.
Sure.
Right? I mean, this is, gentrification as a phenomenon was real and is real and was happening prior to the pandemic. There was sort of an emphasis to urbanization, right? People who in my parents' generation thought the American dream was moving to the suburbs and having a home and having a yard and having a fence and all that, decided, well, now it's time to come back to the city, right? So you have a ton of demand from that side. Then you have unprecedented levels of inflation, and I think, I mean, we're seeing 40-year increases, 40-year highs of inflation. So that creates an increase in prices that's significant. And then in Miami, certainly we've seen a migration, right? We've seen a migration from cities that are considered to be high tax, or maybe even considered to be anti-innovation. So we have now seen an influx of demand. The good news for Miami is we have the ability to grow. Some cities don't. Some cities are built out or have artificially restricted their supply. We right now have 47,000 residential units in our building pipeline, and we have over 6 million square feet of commercial in the pipeline right now. We can grow 10x from where we are right now, and certainly, the trajectory for Miami is one of growth, right? Having said that, we still have to be conscientious of what we're building and who it's serving, and we passed a housing bond. I think the mayor of San Antonio was telling me they're doing something similar in San Antonio. I think you guys have done something similar here as well, where we're leveraging our $100 million of resources at a 15 to 1, 20 to 1, 25 to 1, dollar to one public dollar rate. That's gotten us a couple $2 billion of affordable housing. So we are being very intentional about trying to create housing stock for for the workforce, right? And it's not easy. Yeah. Because of all these market forces, frankly.
It feels like there's something very new going on in American cities where, there has been in the model, and all of the macroeconomic models are built around the idea that there is this very small subset of extraordinarily wealthy people that you want to bring to town. From them will hopefully on a regional level trickle down all of this benefit. And then everybody else coming in is, as you say, let's say an immigrant family coming in from a desperate circumstance or whatever it is, right? But this new thing of a much bigger slice of people with a much higher spending power than we're used to coming into a comparatively small city like Austin or a comparatively small city like San Francisco can totally explode the housing market, can put it entirely out of reach and displace tens of thousands of people as we've seen. Mayor Suarez, how do we prepare for that? It sounds like you have some buffer space. Sure. That perhaps other cities don't enjoy.
Yeah, and let me just say, you've articulated sort of the problem that can happen when that certain subset of people come to a city. Yeah. But we often forget the precondition, right? What's the precondition? The precondition is, for a city like Miami, high poverty, right? And high income inequality. So the question as a policymaker is, well, what do you do about it, right? I mean, are you just going to let the market handle it, or are you going to try to be a force for good? Yeah. And I think, part of the desire on my part to invite innovators, creators, doers, deployers of capital into my city, it's to try to help create wealth, right? To try to help give people pathways of prosperity, right? How do you deal with an impoverished city if you're not empowering people, right? I mean, how else do you do it? I mean, if there's another way, I'd love to know.
Well, there's actually a question coming in that is very much relevant to this. It is much easier to be a poor tenant in California than in Texas. How will you use tech wealth to protect the local working class who serve this new population? I mean, there's a question for both of you, right? Do you seek in some way to directly draw from the money that is arriving in the city? Is there some way to, because ostensibly people are coming here because they want less government intrusion, less taxation, the rest of it, right? And yet, I would imagine in your position, it's quite tempting to just say, well, if you're going to come here and change this city, then we need your help in changing it for the better, I guess.
Well, there are two ways to address affordability. Either you help make things cost less than they would ordinarily, otherwise, or you help people have more money to spend than they might otherwise have had. So you take a look at what's happening with tech, and there are a lot of tech companies coming to Austin that have $150,000, $170,000 a year jobs, and that's great. But that's not the real need of our city. Our city needs the middle skill jobs, the middle income jobs. And there are tons of those in the tech area that you don't need a 4-year degree for, that you need a certificate or a degree, an associate's degree. Tesla coming into our city, I don't really see that as much a manufacturing operation as I see it another tech company that's coming in. And I know that the number of middle skill jobs is real impressive, and they're working with the community college to be able to create tracks within that system to train people to be able to step up. And when you do that, you begin to change someone's life and the family's life and the community's life. So you need to do that. At the same time, we're trying to involve the companies that are coming in to do the lift I just talked about with homelessness, because there's a philanthropic part of that. We're putting a lot of our ARPA dollars toward it, but we need the private sector to help us as well. And then we have companies that are coming in that are beginning to look at building housing for their employee base as they come in. So it's not just one thing. It's as many different things as you can be doing all at once.
Can it be, do you think, Mayor Suarez, an enticement? Can you always spin it as an enticement for companies, or is there a point at which you have to say to an arriving company, we need you to do something extra here? We need you to contribute in some way to protect this city.
I think my humble perspective is that that's a message we give everyone, right? I mean, I don't think that we, and frankly, I think that they expect that as well. In other words, I remember during the Amazon 2 competition, that Amazon was very conscientious of this reputation that tech had gotten about being a gentrifier, right? And they really wanted to become part of the ecosystem, societal fabric that was beyond just being a company coming in and creating jobs or creating opportunities. But if you look at the question, the question is interesting because it says it's easier to be a poor tenant in California than to be a poor tenant in Texas. So the question is, where is it easier to be a poor tenant, right? Instead of, the question is, how do we create prosperity so that we don't have poor tenants?
Yes.
That's the question I think that I struggle with, right? How do we create the conditions for prosperity so that hopefully we can live in a city where we don't have poor tenants, where we have people who are successful? That's what I struggle with every day, mightily. But I do think there is a sense of the affordable housing that's being built in today's America, and I don't know if Mayor Adler will agree with this, but it's being done in a much better quality, right? The quality is better than what it was in the 50s and in the 60s, where it was government housing, and it looked horrible. Right now, because of the public-private partnerships, oftentimes they have community centers, they have gyms, athletic facilities, and people are living with significantly more pride at a more affordable price. And that, by the way, has a ecosystem benefit of reducing crime, of creating much better outcomes that are not just related to one particular segment, which is housing.
Yeah. I think there's a question here. We are a well-funded startup in Miami, but how can the city help small companies fight for senior tech talent in such a hot job market? And this is so interesting because I don't envy you either of your jobs. I mean, I just think that I imagine you trying to explain to your father or to your predecessor in 1972, I'm trying to defend poor working tenants against an influx of money. That's a problem that mayors would not have thought they would have had necessarily a couple of, a generation ago. This is an interesting question. I want to sort of ask it in a general way, but it also makes me think of a question that I really wanted to put in front of both of you, which is, like so many mayors, you are both the running a bastion of progressive politics that wants to bring tech talent from wherever it's coming, but specifically from California much of the time. And we're seeing a wave of laws being passed in both of your states that to a Californian seem like they're from another world, and right now, I was just looking at a study that had found that 1 in 4 elementary school students in California in some form identifies as gender fluid or non-binary, right? That they're not thinking, it's a generational thing, that they're just not thinking of themselves as he, she anymore. And yet, we have new bills in which you cannot say the word trans in school if you're a teacher, in elementary school. How do you deal with that as the mayors of your respective cities, in a place where the state laws are pushing this culture war that really, I have to imagine, is only going to hurt your efforts to try to draw people in from a place like California? Either of you, tell me about that.
Yeah, I mean, Miami is pretty much known, has a reputation for being incredibly inclusive, very pro-LGBTQ. As a community, and so that's part of our brand. It's part of who we are. The diversity, our diversity it's not just geographical diversity or racial diversity. It's also certainly inclusion. I think it's a more fundamental problem in today's politics where we, for some reason, or maybe for reasons that we can articulate, we seem to want to focus on things that divide us as opposed to things that unite us. There's so much to unite us. There's so many big problems. I mean, we've talked about a lot of the fundamental problems of income inequality, which is I call it, generational original sin, if you will, because it's something that's been there since the beginning of humanity. And you hope that technology and some of these people that come into your city, and I felt that they have a sense of social responsibility. And many of them, since, to your point, your earlier point, they think about solving big problems. I mean, these are the biggest problems, right? So it's exciting to think that there may be people in your city that have the ability to use technology as a problem solver to deal with some of these systemic and big issues. But certainly anything that creates division in our cities, in our lexicon, in our states, is something that makes our life more difficult. And I think we all, just as mayors, I'm remembering so many different lessons I've learned. I was talking to Mayor Adler in the background, how we think of each other as human beings. We don't think of each other as, I don't think of the letter next to his name on, what he, in terms of how he identifies on a party platform, right? I think of him as an incredible innovator, as a great person, as someone who's very positive, who cares deeply about his city. It's not about all this other stuff. And I just wonder why we keep doing that, to ourselves, really, because that's...
And how, as a mayor, do you handle, I mean, obviously, one would like to be able to remain, above that, but, whereas once upon a time a mayor could have maybe just said, I'm going to stay neutral, stay out of this, I mean, today, right, you've got the CEO of Disney having to issue multiple apologies for their involvement with candidates who've espoused anti-LGBTQ perspectives, and you've got people walking out of Pixar and issuing angry letters. You cannot essentially engage with a high-tech workforce or the kind of workforce you would want to draw here unless you're willing to take a real strong position one way or the other about this kind of thing. So what do you do in that situation?
I don't think you should strive to stay above that fray, because the personal cost is so high. But I think it does go to the branding. Miami is a city that is welcoming of people from all over. Austin the same way, and I think that what's happening at the state level now in our state leadership is horrific, and I think that it is frightening. The number of parents, families with trans kids that I've talked to who are just scared to death. As a mayor, I joined with my colleagues on the council, with our district attorney and our county attorney, who pledged not to prosecute any kind of action that was ever brought, to be able to say to our community and others, this is a safe place for people to be. I issued a proclamation and turned and gave it to Kai, a young trans woman whose mother was there, and I handed it to her, and the proclamation, she started crying and turned and hugged me at my waist. I nearly lost it. I mean, these are real people and real families, and I don't think you strive to stay above that. But I think that communities are, tech people, like most good-hearted people, are attracted to cities where those values exist. So I don't think you try to stay above something like that. I think it's really important for communities to be very loud and vocal.
It is interesting. I mean, it really does make each of you something of an island in your respective states, and yet you will wind up drawing in theory, a workforce that will benefit the state enormously. It's a strange position to be in. I mean, when you know, I don't know that I've ever seen city and state leadership at such loggerheads around something like this for no apparent purpose other than likes on Facebook. I mean, I really just don't get it, you know.
I take the position that the legislature, you know, we have great cities in Texas. Dallas is a great city, Houston, San Antonio. We're all different cities and with different kinds of economies. And someone that's attracted to live in Austin, probably not attracted to live in Houston or Dallas and vice versa. So our state has this diversified portfolio of cities, which makes sense in your retirement account the same way it makes sense, I think, in having cities that are diversified. And the attempt at the state level to make all the cities the same is really short-sighted and not in the state's interest.
Yeah. Let's take, just broadly speaking, this question here. We are a well-funded startup in Miami, but how can the city help small companies fight for senior tech talent in such a hot job market? Like if you did have to go out and make that pitch, try to recruit, you know, a senior tech person, somebody who can literally live anywhere they want, how do you make that pitch about Miami?
I think it's happening. I think it's happening because we are a city that has adopted a pro-innovation framework. I think it's happening because, you know, I think people didn't know whether Miami had enough critical mass to sustain an ecosystem of this kind. And I think the pandemic, even though it was obviously horrific for many, created an opportunity for Miami to create that critical mass because many people decided they wanted to be in Miami, working remotely, and they proved the model could work. Once that happened and the critical mass was here, then momentum takes over, right? And I call it the Flymo effect. So it's a combination of flywheel plus fear of missing out. So we're right now, combined by the way, we're right now #1 in the nation in tech job growth. I mean, who would have thought that Miami would be #1 in the nation in tech job growth? We're #1 in the nation in tech job migration. If you look at Silicon Valley, and I was using the numbers of Miami, in terms of it being 70% of the people not being born there that live there, I think Silicon Valley is like 95%. So again, if you aggregate capital, you're going to draw talent, right? So the mass aggregation of capital, I think, is going to draw a significant amount of talent. I also think we have to take the next step, and one of the things that Austin does well with you know, University of Texas is it's known as a high-level Tier 1 academic institution, right? And I think if you look at tech hubs across the country and across the world, there's a unification between the aggregation of talent, creation of talent, and a high-end Tier 1 institution, university. And so that's a challenge for us, right? We have to sort of take a step up, and we're working with a variety of people to do that with our already existing institutions, and even to potentially create new institutions. So it's exciting. As a mayor, that is something that is exciting because you know that education is that pathway to equality, to fairness. And I think when you think about that poor tenant who is living in our cities, right, you think about what are the kind of skills that person needs to be able to get out of that condition, right? And so upskilling is a major component of what we're trying to do in Miami, working through the largest community college in the country, which is Miami-Dade Community College. We're doing that in a symbiotic program to give people an opportunity to upskill for free and to integrate themselves into this new economy. But I think people also have to understand that this new economy is not just creating engineering jobs. These companies that are being birthed in our cities are creating a broad spectrum of jobs: marketing, sales, accounting, law, et cetera. So and they're high paying most of the time. So I think for Miami, that was a predominantly tourism and real estate driven economy with some finance. seeing this evolution is incredibly empowering. I call it sort of the family reunification act for our city, because so many of our citizens, grew up in the city, went to high school in the city, and then left for Ivy League caliber educational institutions, and many of them didn't come back because they couldn't create the companies of their dreams in our city. And now, since that's happening, we're starting to see people come back to their families, and I get parents all the time telling me, look, we're so happy, Nanito who was gone, came back, or Juanito, or so that's exciting for me. It's fulfilling.
Yeah.
And it's not just city direct action, it's also indirect action. It's creating a climate to be able to attract the talent, and it is real competitive. Just a few days ago, there was an announcement with Capital Factory, with Stacks, of an incubator accelerator program. I think they're calling it City of Coins. They're looking, by the way, for 2 more protocols to join in, that it will have $1,500,000 challenges. And providing co-working space and support. So in a city like ours, a lot of it is in a very decentralized way, just trying to enable that kind of grassroots work.
Right. I was sitting this morning and talking to somebody from New York, and they were asking me about the distinction between San Francisco and where Austin is at in terms of how Austin has changed. And this brings us to a question that came up here. In Austin, we've seen a number of beloved historic businesses close because of the tax burden on their real estate. How do we keep the cultural fabric intact? And in San Francisco, a lot of the very beloved, this was a working class port town once upon a time, and so a lot of the really beloved places, the bohemian, the beats and the rest of it, was like it is in so many cities, an outgrowth of the, it was artists moving to the derelict places and then, creating something beloved, but now it's gotten to a place where only somebody who is either willing to lose money on that piece of real estate because of the extraordinary tax burden and the extraordinary rent, or a big multinational chain. Those are the only ones that can really afford commercial real estate in San Francisco any longer. What does one do in your position to keep, a great boot shop, here, even though, because so much of this wealth is changing the tax picture, is changing the real estate picture? How do you keep the equilibrium there?
Well, we're not going to be able to stop gentrification, because it's going to happen as more people come with more money to spend. But the dislocation associated with gentrification is something that you can do something about. But when you're running head-on into market, you need counter-market initiatives. Example, the voters in this city just approved a $7.2 billion mass public transit system in our city. It's really exciting. It's going to have an additional 2 rail lines. It's going to be underground downtown, and it's going to provide transportation to parts of our city that have never had the mobility access. But as part of that transportation effort, there's a $300 million line item only to help with this dislocation for both residential and commercial.
How does that work? How do you spend that money? How does that work?
Well, we have a community group that's working with the city leadership and city policymakers. That community group just made their recommendations on the spend of the first $65 million, which was one of the first dollars in to this mass transit program that is being used immediately to help businesses and people stay where they are.
Yeah. Is that something that's available to you, Mayor Suarez? Can you offset the market in the way that Mayor Adler's talking about?
Well, I think for us, we're looking at, it's very difficult.
Yeah.
Very difficult to do. I think.
Why is it so difficult? I want to understand that part.
We've kept taxes historically low.
Right.
So for us, we've kept taxes at about a 1960 year low in terms of a percentage, right? We call it the millage rate, which is our property tax. What's ironic is our budget's actually grown. So the lower we've lowered taxes, the more resources that we have. But we do control the millage rate. We don't control property value appreciations, and we don't control the new construction, right? So, but the property value appreciation is also gone up significantly. So taxes, even if we control the rate and start lowering the rate, it can still go up based on appreciation, right? So it's tough. It's very, very difficult for government, which is limited in nature and scope, and is supposed to be, in my view, an institution that is supposed to do the things that everybody needs us to do, right? We police our streets well. We obviously respond with fire rescue on a 911 call, et cetera, keep our city clean, et cetera. And then you're now asking government to solve macro problems. And so then it becomes tough, because what do? Do you grow the size of government? Well, we know growing the size of government creates other issues, right? Because it creates the issue that they're worried about, which is increasing in taxes, right? The other problem is you can grow, in my opinion, you can grow government beyond its competency level. And I think that creates problems, because then you're just taxing and having other issues. So I think it's hard to deal with some of these macro factors, and I think we've tried to do it by keeping taxes low. We've tried to do it by focusing on keeping our city safe, doing the things that we do well. And I think that's created a significant, safe city, which has built us a brand that we can market.
Right. So last one for both of you. Let's say that you could magically gather together a mayor from, say, 20 years ago and a mayor from 20 years from now, and you needed to be able to coordinate between the two of them. You could sit them down and you say, okay, I need you, mayor of 20 years ago, to set the conditions that's going to help you, mayor of 20 years from now, really be set up for success. Because you guys sit in this crazy transition right now in which the American workforce is being transformed, the nature of work is being transformed, the Great Resignation, right? We're just seeing, economists right now are tearing their hair out because their models aren't working anymore, right? We're figuring out a new system for living in America. What would you say to the mayor of 20 years ago, Mayor Adler, to help, your successor a generation from now succeed? What preconditions did you need, would you have needed, to have a successful future?
It's really hard, I think, to predict 20 years ago where we would be today, and near impossible as we sit here today to believe that we can predict what are the practical policy issues or challenges 20 years from now. So I think that really what you need to focus on are your core values. It's kind of, to thine own self be true. I mean, just to be really clear and definite about what's important to a city. What does that city want to be? And for us, I think that's always been the guiding principle. It's what's guided the people that have chosen to come here. It's the respect issue. It's the work we do to preserve the environment. It's a cultural issue. The population growth in Austin is geometric, doubling in population in the Austin area every 25 years.
Yeah.
That is the same growth rate that the city's had since 1850. And it's been linear as a percentage since then. So I think there's something in the water here or the air. But as a practical matter, I don't know what you do other than ground yourself in cultural decisions about who you are, and then try to stay true to them. And if you are, then I think that becomes a guiding framework with respect to what the policies need to be at any point in time.
Mayor Suarez, I mean, you've had long relationships with people who used to govern.
Yeah, I would have focused on two things. One is I would have focused on environmental resiliency. 20 years ago, you probably could not have seen that 20 years from then, we would be dealing with climatic events that would challenge our infrastructure. So that would have been one. Second one I would have told him 20 years ago is, if you want us to be successful in 20 years, focus on transportation infrastructure, right? And I think that would have helped ease things, our growth, over the last 20 years. It's one of the most prevalent complaints that I get is that we didn't plan for our growth as well as we should have or could have. I actually think necessity is the mother of invention. And so the private sector finds ways to innovate around government's inability to solve a problem. So you see a few things. One is micromobility, obviously scooters, you see them here, sort of micromobility options, which is a private sector hack on inability to have a true, public transportation system in certain areas. You see what I call 15-minute walkable cities, right? Miami just got ranked the highest #1 in 15-minute walkable cities. So sort of the development community hacking the lack of mass transit and saying, hey, we're just going to aggregate things so that people don't have to go so far, right? Obviously, remote work, I talked a little bit about how much that as a phenomenon has changed things and allowed us to sort of save time in transportation. And then I think you're going to see other kinds of technologies, boring technology. You're going to see urban air mobility in my lifetime, autonomous vehicles. So I think those are other hacks that we're going to see that are going to make transportation hopefully not be as big an issue in my generation as it was in the previous generation.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank both of you for your time this morning. It's so interesting. It feels like once upon a time, what you are both describing, my mom would have referred to as high quality problems, but I also think that they are not. It turns out that these are much more existential difficulties than we realized, and for all the extraordinary innovation and benefit that we're seeing in a place like South by Southwest, all these amazing ideas and all of that, it is, I think, extremely difficult to shepherd that into practical considerations in a city, and so I wish you both the very best with that. Please thank the mayors for being with us this morning.